Greetings to all the learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. In the lecture, we shall be having a discussion on the review of the book Power and Interdependence by Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye. In this lecture, while reviewing this book, we shall also be analyzing key ideas, academic context, evolving debate of this very important book. This book is a very significant referred textbook when we look at the realm of international relations literature. We shall also understand the role of non-military power, non-state actors in international politics as we review this book. We shall also analyze main ideas of neoliberalism as an approach in international politics. In this lecture, we shall also look at the bigger picture of textual and contextual reading, look in the main framework, assumptions of neoliberalism, issues of power, national interest, non-state actors, globalization, as we review the book Power and Interdependence. Once again, dear friends, today we will be reviewing the work of Robert O. Keohane and Joseph S. Nye Jr., Power and Interdependence, World Politics in Transition. Now, we all know that this is a very significant work in the realm of international relations theory. This work was first published in the year 1977. Robert O. Keohane, Professor of International Relations at Princeton University, Joseph S. Nye Jr., University Distinguished Service Professor at Harvard University. Now, in this book, Power and Interdependence, the focus areas have been explaining the dynamics, that what are the factors that actually go to influence the world affairs, power politics. Now, what makes this work different from other work is that it gives a new framework of analysis of power politics in world affairs. Further, this work presents a very significant new framework, that is, it presents an analysis of the concept of complex interdependence. Now, with this focus areas looking at how power politics can be influenced by non-military economic avenues, how complex interdependence guides the dynamics of interactions in international relations, this book indeed presents some very significant inputs. Now, we all know that while doing analysis and review of any work, textual and contextual analysis are very useful. Both textual and contextual analysis are employed for reviewing analysis of various works. What is a text? Text, dear learners, refers to the words, the ideas which are stated and written. What is the context then? Dear learners, context is the surrounding of the text, the framework, the time scenario within which the text is situated. So, the textual reading focuses on the text itself, whereas the contextual reading implies we have to interpret and quote the textual material, understanding the environment, the time framework. When we try to debate any literature in the realm of international relations, we all know that realism has been the dominant paradigm. Realism as a school of thought, from the work of Thucydides, the ideas of Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, to Nebuhr, to E.H. Carr, to Hans Morgenthau, has always been contrasted with the broad ideas of the realist school of thought, namely state as the important unit of analysis and depicting the pessimistic aspects of human nature to describe the conflictual elements of international reality. This is often contrasted with idealism. Now, idealism, if we analyze in the work of important ideas as we see in the then US President Woodrow Wilson's 14-point speech, which talks about peace and cooperative mechanisms. Now, realism, as contrast to idealism, focuses on the military issues. This work that we are analyzing, Power and Interdependence by Keohane Nye, puts a question mark, a question on the military and economic interests. This work deliberates upon it whether the focus on military interests alone is it sufficient in international relations. Then again, as a contrast with the realist perspective, Power and Interdependence, the book, gets the idea that states are indeed important actors, but can we ignore the non-state actors? So this comparative analysis of states and non-state actors in international relations has been presented to us in the book Power and Interdependence. Now, once again, as we are now looking at the text Power and Interdependence from the contextual aspect, the textual aspect wherein we are looking at the actual idea stated. Let us now get the book towards the contextual side. We all know, end of Second World War, realism became a dominant paradigm in international relations. After the Second World War, there was Cold War, the war through ideological framework, propaganda, and herein, before the end of the Cold War, looking at the changes which were being ushered in the global economy, the rise of international institutions, the rise of new dynamics of power in the economic realm, Power and Interdependence, this work by Keohane Nye, tries to understand the changes of this international reality, looking at this time framework of before the end of the Cold War. Now, year 1977, the year wherein the book was written, really then, looking at this time, this book is indeed significant then, firstly because it broadened the prevailing realist worldview. Secondly, this book anticipated many of the developments that world witnessed in post-Cold War era, the era of globalization, the post-Cold War time, amongst others. Now, further, dear learners, as we are trying to understand the review of Power and Interdependence, we must also understand that even within the academic circles, it tried to give a new light, a new perspective to liberalism as a theory in international relations. We all know that liberalism in political theory stands for liberty of the individual. It signifies a viewpoint that gives primacy to freedom of the individual. Now, herein, how trade emancipates, how trade adds more to freedom of the individual was aptly substantiated in this work Power and Interdependence, and further this work gives a new perspective to liberalism, namely the framework of neoliberalism. Let's now have a look at the contents of the book. Part 1 talks about understanding interdependence. There are chapters on interdependence in world politics, realism and complex interdependence, explaining international regime change. Further, there is a part on regime change in oceans and money. There are chapters on politics of oceans and money, historical overview, complex interdependence in oceans and money, politics of rule making in oceans and money. There are chapters on regimes and two bilateral relationship, that is United States relationship with Canada and Australia, United States and complex interdependence, coping with interdependence. And what is essential, that chapter 9 and 10, they have been recently added in recent editions. Chapter 9 talking about power, interdependence and the information age. Chapter 10 talking about power, interdependence and globalism. Now, we all know that the book, as we just pointed out, was published in 1977. But since then, as we pointed out, there have been 2 additional chapters added in recent editions. Chapter 9 presents some very significant information about the information age, and chapter 10 examines the effects of globalism on world politics. Now, chapter on realism and complex interdependence states that realism opines that states are unitary actors. It's analyzes how the main concerns of realism have been the military concerns. And no doubt these military concerns, they dominate international politics. Complex interdependence highlights that there are multiple channels, multiplicity of connections, transnational relations, multinational cooperations, international organizations. The concept of complex interdependence also puts forward the aspect that there is an absence of hierarchy among issues in the realm of foreign affairs. Now, what we see here is that this work gives us an understanding of the dynamics and processes of complex interdependence. It discusses that how this aspect of multiple channel, multiplicity of connections, transnational relations, absence of hierarchy among issues, all of it, how it translates into power processes. What is essential here is that 1977, the time when this book was written, was the time framework where nobody had actually thought that international relations will undergo so much change. And further, in the post-Cold War era, 1990s onwards, when the world witnesses the end of the Cold War, the world witnesses the dissolution of USSR, the world witnesses rise of new power center, and then there is a debate on rise of new forms of security, the non-traditional security threats where economics indeed play a very important role. So this book indeed presented thought ahead of its time, looking at the dynamics and the processes of complex interdependence. Another important insight that this work presents is that of economic interdependence. Today we all know economic interdependence is an important feature of world politics. Globalization, interdependence between states, it positively affects behavioral patterns and changes the way states cooperate. Now, this book pointed this very important aspect way back, and today when we look at international reality, how today trade war has become an important form of warfare, how today states conflict over tariff and non-tariff barriers. So, no doubt interdependence then impacts the behavioral pattern and changes the way states cooperate. This has been aptly demonstrated in the work Power and Interdependence. Now, this work highlights the very important idea of absolute gains. Now, this is very essential because when we look at the earlier existing realist and the new realist school of thought, the focus was on relative gains. This book highlights that just mere focus on relative gains is not appropriate. Why? Because, as the book answers, economic interdependence ensures that neither side can effectively exploit the economic relationship and take advantage of the other politically. Now, we all know that any academic work leads to further debates. The same applies to the work Power and Interdependence also. In the realm of international relations, once the book Power and Interdependence by Keohane Nye was presented, there were a lot of thinking as to over the main arguments presented in the book. An important academic work by Joseph Grieco, Anarchy and the Limits of Cooperation, a realist critique of the newest liberal institutionalism. This work was there in International Organization in 1988, and here Grieco points out that the realist perspective that states are positional, not atomistic in character. States are primarily concerned with how others might benefit from cooperative arrangements. So, this becomes a very important critique of the idea of cooperation the work of Keohane Nye was putting forward. Another important debate that was there with the work of J. Mearsheimer, that was the false promise of international institutions. The work was there in International Security in 1995. Herein the idea was that institutions have little influence on state behavior. So, what we see here is that how this very important work, Power and Interdependence, led to new forms of thinking, new ways of analysis of international relations. Now, as we are situating Power and Interdependence, this book by Keohane Nye, in the bigger framework of international relations, one has to take into account the inter-paradigm debate. Now, what is this debate? This debate highlights the arguments and tensions within the framework of understanding international relations. We had the neo-neo debate that though not in the debate now, we also see that the debate between neo-realism and neoliberalism, though it's not there in the debate now in the contemporary times. However, dear learners, but earlier, during the time when the work of Keohane Nye was there, and there were a lot of revisions and debates on the work of both Keohane Nye as well as Kenneth Waltz, earlier neo-neo debate had a significant role in the development of the discipline, looking at points of similarities and dissimilarities between neo-realism and neoliberalism as an approach to understand international reality. O.V. Auer's work, that is, this very important work, The Rise and Fall of the Inter-Paradigm Debate. Now, this is from this very important work, International Theory, Positivism and Beyond. It points out that both neo-realism and neoliberal institutionalism, as the work says, and we quote, self-limiting redefinition towards an anti-metaphysical theoretical minimalism, and they became increasingly compatible. So, what was the outcome? Neo-synthesis became the research program in 1980s. So, what we see here is the similarities between neo-realism and neoliberal institutionalism, as we can also depict while going through the various arguments in the book Power and Interdependence, that both are state-centric. That implies they consider state as the rational unit of analysis. Secondly, they both are rational theories. Rational theories that are somewhere status quoist in their orientation. Now, for both, the context and framework of IR is same. Once again, when we look at the work by Greco's work, Anarchy and the Limits of Cooperation, a realist critique of the newest liberal institutionalism, there is a very important aspect that is debated in this work, how Greco points out, and we quote, that understanding of international anarchy, that is an absence of a common interstate government, it is prevalent in both the framework, neo-realism also as well as neoliberal institutionalism. Now, some of the important perspectives that Keohane Nye point out in their work, that is, they give us an understanding that what do we really mean by dependence today in today's world, especially the economic interdependence. Dependence means a state of being determined or significantly affected by external forces. Interdependence, as they quote and we read it from the book, more simply defined means mutual dependence. Interdependence in world politics refers to situations characterized by reciprocal effects among countries or among actors in different countries. Another significant aspect that the book points out, and once again we quote from the book, the politics of economic and ecological interdependence involves competition even when large net benefits can be expected from cooperation. Further, this book makes a very important highlight about the context of the world politics, that is, the dividing line between domestic and foreign policy becomes blurred, and there is, and as we are quoting from the book, no clear agenda in interstate relations. There are multiple issues which are not arranged in a clear or consistent hierarchy. Among other things, military security does not consistently dominate the agenda. This book also makes some very important highlights, that is, once again we quote from the book, intense relationship of mutual influence may exist, but force is no more considered an appropriate way of achieving other goals such as economic and ecological welfare, which are becoming more important because mostly the effects of military force are very costly and uncertain. So, dear learners, the important argument here is that the book highlights that traditional view of power as defined as military power, military strength is somewhere limited, is somewhere just not the sole reliance on military power as framework of analysis will be inappropriate looking at the complexity of IR. Regimes are immediate factors between the power structure of the international system, and somewhere this also reflects the power structure of the system. Gradual or rapid changes in regime, therefore, is important in interpreting their influence. Role of international organization in order to understand international agenda setting, catalyst for coalition formation, amongst others. All of it needs to be seen and analyzed. So, dear learners, what we find here that this book, Power and Interdependence, pointing towards that how mere reliance on military aspects is not sufficient. One must look at multiple connections, multiple channels, regimes. Indeed, it points out to a new framework in terms of understanding international relations. This work paved way for coming up for emergence of neoliberal perspective in international relations, which highlighted the issues of absolute gains, reciprocal effects, interdependence, issues which were that at the time when the book was written in 1977, which were maybe not that important that time, but today when we look at the post-Cold War era, the era defined by globalization, economic gains, external forces, international organizations, transnational relations, indeed play an important role. We hope the lecture on analysis of Robert Keohane and Joseph Nye's work, Power and Interdependence, presented to you significant inputs and insights. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much.